What's going on, guys? Today we're talking about deadlifts and more specifically, frequency of deadlifts. So I often get asked a question, how many times a week should I deadlift? And the answer is always, it depends, but we can do better than that. We can get a little bit more dialed in on what would be ideal for you based on your goals and actually provide you with some form of substantial answer and direction to head into. So in this video, we're going to talk about deadlift frequency from a goals-focused basis and discuss what types of goals would dictate what types of frequency would be best for you. All right, so before we dive into the specifics for programming deadlift frequency and looking at goals, let's first set the stage and talk about some critical aspects that need to be considered when looking at weekly deadlift frequency. So, first aspect is your training age. How long have you been training? This will heavily influence your dictation of how often you should deadlift on a weekly basis based on your goals. So it's important to consider, are you a beginner? Are you an intermediate? Are you an advanced lifter? And so forth. Another thing you need to consider is the intensity and volume, or the loading in which you are putting into your deadlift sessions. These two factors will dictate fatigue accumulation and so forth. So as you progress and work towards deadlifting more frequently a week, you're not burning yourself out. So once we consider these bigger landscape focused on this topic specifically, we can start diving into our next sections, which is going to be discussing goals. But it is important to consider those because at the end of the day, we have to remember the bigger picture. We can't just start deadlifting 4 times a week out of nowhere and program all of the same loading styles and expect to keep making progress. That might work for a week, maybe 2 at that, but we're eventually going to hit a wall. So we do need strategy when selecting volume, load, and understanding how our training age can influence all of these factors. But now let's dive into our first goal when assessing deadlift frequency: skill acquisition. So for the goal of skill acquisition, your frequency is going to vary a lot. And that's because when we are practicing a skill like the deadlift, more frequency is usually better when it comes to dialing in certain aspects of form, the skill itself, and building good mechanics. So when it comes to skill acquisition, generally you're going to want to deadlift at least 2 times a week. You might even deadlift 4 or 5 times a week. There are actually programs out there that deadlift every single day. But I would say probably 2 to 4 is the sweet spot for most folks. Now, when it comes to loading and so forth with this style of frequency, I would suggest doing a slightly heavier loaded day, a more like an intermediate loaded day with a little bit of a higher rep. And then if you are focusing on the skill aspect of the deadlift, focusing on what specifically you're trying to improve. Is it form as a whole, or is it, let's say, your lockout, or let's say it's breaking the floor? If you can dial in a specific aspect that you are trying to focus on, then you could focus on variations for that 3rd and 4th deadlift day that hyper focuses on those aspects. So if you have trouble off the floor, adding in tempo deadlifts, adding in pause deadlifts. If you have problems at lockout, maybe doing some form of rack pull and so forth. So when it comes to the topic of skill acquisition, I would recommend scheduling deadlifts, or programming deadlifts for that matter, 2 to 4 times a week, having a slightly heavier day with like moderate to lower reps, a lighter day with moderate to higher reps, and then having variation days where you are focusing on aspects that you need to improve on. Now, obviously, again, with higher frequencies, we need to account for other styles of loading and exercises we're doing throughout the weekly program so we don't accumulate too much fatigue, but that I think is a good baseline framework for the topic of skill acquisition. All right, so moving into our next goal, the goal of strength. This is probably the most nuanced goal that we can kind of account for because there are so many different ways to approach this, especially when we consider hyper-focused goals. So if you're a power lifter or if you're just a recreational athlete, then we could ask the question like, do you even need to barbell deadlift if you are just a recreational athlete? But let's assume that you are a recreational lifter, you might be a power lifter and so forth, and you want to improve your deadlift strength specifically. So you're sold, you want to do more deadlifts. How often should you do them to improve your strength? So I like to break this into 2 different categories. We have a beginner side and more of like an intermediate and advanced side. So for the beginner athlete, generally 1 to 2 times a week of deadlifting will be plenty. It doesn't take a lot to get a beginner stronger, and at the end of the day, we do not need to be accumulating too much fatigue and overloading them with so many barbell movements that they also need to focus on. So my point being, is that 1 to 2 times a week deadlifting for a beginner will usually be great, because if you have squats, bench presses, overhead presses, all these other movements that they are trying to learn and improve on, we don't need to just have a ton of extra barbell frequency in there. So 1 to 2 times a week for a beginner is usually a good bet, and that's how I like to program for beginners when it comes to deadlift frequency. Now, what those days look like, generally if it's 2 times a week, it will be one day with a higher rep scheme and like a moderate loading. Then the other day we'll have more of a moderate loading and a moderate rep scheme, maybe a little bit of a higher loading depending on where they are in their training age. Now, if I am only having a beginner deadlift once a week, it's going to be more of a moderate loading, moderate to high rep scheme, trying to get the most bang for our buck for only deadlifting once a week. Now, let's look at the intermediate and advanced lifter. How many times a week should they deadlift to improve their strength? So generally this will range from like 1 to 3 times a week. Higher trained intermediates and advanced athletes can probably handle a little bit more of a training volume, but then we have to consider that these athletes are probably training with heavier weights, so we do need to factor those two in and balance them. But if we are looking at deadlifting once a week for an intermediate athlete, generally, again, like that moderate loading, moderate rep scheme with a little bit of a higher loading scheme may be best, especially for strength-focused goals. We do need to push our strength component of the lift if we want to improve on that aspect. So staying super light isn't going to do us a lot if we're only deadlifting once a week as an intermediate athlete. Now, for deadlifting twice a week and our goal is strength, I think shadowing similar structure to what we did with the beginner, so somewhat of a moderate loading, moderate to higher rep scheme, and then maybe a heavier loading with a lower rep scheme would be your best bet. You're getting more of a hypertrophy focus with a little bit of a strength component, and then you're getting more of a pure strength component with those 2 different days. If you're deadlifting 3 times a week, I would recommend doing a similar structure to the 2-day a week, but then also adding a 3rd day in for variations or aspects of your training that you need to improve on, specifically when it comes to strength. And again, that focuses back to our skill acquisition section, where we discussed breaking down hyper-focused variations to improve on specific goals. We can do that for strength-focused goals too. So if I'm weak through the 20 to 30% range of that pull, so right as I break the floor working through that shin angle, then I'm going to be adding in tempo deadlifts and so forth with moderate loading to moderate to higher reps to accrue extra volume with that area that I need focus on specifically when it comes to strength. So to wrap that all up, beginners, generally 1 to 2 times a week of deadlifting should benefit you plenty. And then for advanced and intermediate lifters, that is going to vary a lot. And I would definitely recommend hitting up a coach for specifics here, but 1 to 3 times a week with a deadlifting frequency will usually be best. And now note that this is void of powerlifters and strength sport specific athletes that need to deadlift for competition. We're not talking about them. That is a whole other animal. But for this video, 1 to 3 times a week is generally best for strength when it comes to intermediate and advanced lifters. All right, so let's chat on the final goal, and that's of maintenance. So how much do you need to just maintain your deadlift strength in general? And for me as a coach, I would recommend doing deadlifts once a week. And that kind of agrees with research when it comes to looking at the minimum effective dose that we need to improve strength on the barbell lifts. Now, diving into a little bit more of the specifics aspect of what I just mentioned, a meta-analysis published in December 2019 looked at the minimum effective dose of lifting frequency, loading, and volume needed to improve the squat, bench press, and deadlift. And what they found was this: for the squat and bench press, performing 6 to 12 reps 2 to 3 times a week with loading between 70 to 85% of 1 RM was enough to slightly increase the strength of these lifts. Now, they noted that for the deadlift specifically, research is still a little bit too limited to draw definitive conclusions on best case scenarios when it comes to reps, loading, and frequencies and so forth. But I think if we look at what we probably experience on a weekly basis and what that research suggests, if we program the deadlift once a week, we are probably going to be fine. And that also agrees with other research that focuses on deadlift frequency and just overall strength maintenance. So for maintenance, I would recommend performing anywhere from 3 to 6 sets once a week with 4 to 6, maybe 8 reps of the deadlift, and then programming anywhere from 70 to 85% of your 1 rep max. I think that should be plenty to maintain your strength. So now note that's for more beginner and intermediate lifters. An advanced lifter is going to have a much higher training stimulus, and that's going to be much more complicated to program a minimum effective dose to keep them progressing and maintaining what they already have. if you're at the upper peak of your strength levels, then obviously you're gonna have to be a lot more strategic with this aspect. But my beginners, intermediates, deadlifting once a week with a moderate loading to a moderate to higher rep scheme should be plenty to maintain your strength levels. Hopefully you're able to take something away from this video when it comes to focusing on deadlift frequency and your goals. There isn't really a perfect amount, but there is an ideal amount focused on who you are and what your goals are. So if you have any questions on deadlift frequency specifically, drop them down below. And remember, at the end of the day, when we alter a specific lift and then alter a training variable such as frequency, we have to account for the bigger picture of our program, the exercise selection we're using, the loading, and so forth to ensure we make steady progress. If you need help with your progress, check out the link down below. I do offer affordable coaching and programming. And if you have any questions on this topic, make sure to drop them in the comments below. And as always, guys, like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.